Was it fair for me to lose my son because he decided to desert? Was it fair to his fellow soldiers who were brothers in arms with him to leave them behind? Was it fair for them to go out looking for him, worried?
Be honest. To treat him as a hero, he wasn't a hero. To have, high up officials say that he served with honor and distinction. And I think what happened is that got quite a few service members who knew the truth upset.
PFC Matthew Martinek was 20 years of age when he was killed searching for Bowe Bergdahl. Now, this gentleman was at one time a proud member of the American military. He then voluntarily walked away from his unit, putting his life, that of his team on the ground, and maybe even American security in jeopardy. There are those who seek sympathy for Bowe Bergdahl after years in confinement at the hands of our enemy, and those who knew he would be facing deserved time behind bars. Let the discussion begin then. Welcome back, retired U.S. Army Colonel, intelligence expert, and the man who was slammed by many when he predicted Bergdahl would be charged with desertion. Tony Shaffer is back in the house. Good to see you, Lieutenant Colonel.
Oh, thanks, Ed. Thanks. Good to be on with you. Thank you for having me.
Here we go back then to the time when you said he would be charged with desertion. Was that simply not a fait accompli and it was the right thing to do?
Well, look, the separation of two investigations done independently, years apart, coming to the same conclusion based on the same facts, led me to believe in October that the process would be swift and direct. It was not because of the politics. And let me be clear on this. It took some time for the Army to noodle this through, to go through the process, to review a linear foot of documentation. That's a lot to go through. And General Milley, God bless him, had to go through it. I do believe it was a fair process. I believe it was a very thorough process. And the Army, thank goodness, did not cave to the political pressure brought to bear on them by the White House, starting with, Ed, by the way, President Obama's Rose Garden ceremony announcing the return of Bergdahl. That was the first undue command influence on the situation, and good for the Army, good for General Milley for standing up and pushing forward to do the right thing.
I want to go back to two things that were said in the last couple of months about Bowe Bergdahl. First, back on June the 1st of last year, Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, said that he, quote, served the United States with honor and distinction. Then I want to go to what was said by Brooke Baldwin on the CNN news show, where she said, this is someone who was held for 5 years by terrorists. Is that not, this is what some would say, is that not punishment enough? Basically seeking sympathy for Bowe Bergdahl. Should anyone have sympathy for a man who walked away from his duty?
Well, and by the way, CNN called my comments in January inflammatory, that I was calling for his indictment, if you will. Look, the bottom line is this. People died because of Bergdahl's bad behavior. The motivation behind his behavior, that's not for discussion at this point in time. The point is he walked away willingly from his post in the middle of combat. This was a combat mission where people were actively out trying to do counterterrorism operations. And what's worse here, Ed, is that there were 5 U.S. service members killed in the line of duty trying to find Bergdahl. Plus, I was contacted this morning by one of the senior intelligence officers who was actually involved in the search for Bergdahl, and he reminded me that several British soldiers as well died in the effort to recover Bergdahl. So this wasn't just the U.S. military, this was the coalition forces as well. So it's important to recognize that this one act of bad behavior, people died, and more importantly, in many ways, despite their deaths, is that we were forced to give back 5 Taliban senior leaders who, by all accounts, have not given up violence, 3 of which are now in contact or attempting to contact the Taliban so they can roll back in May when they're released to go back to trying to kill coalition forces, to include Americans who, by the way, are going to be there at least 2 more years.
I got about a minute left before we take a break, come back and then touch on some foreign policy here. But does this, in your opinion, then, show the stunning naivete of the Obama administration, then, when we take into account everything that has been done since the moment we found Bowe Bergdahl was missing?
Let me use a Star Trek metaphor, if you will. There's a scene in Star Trek with the Wrath of Khan where they figure out at the end, Khan, a brilliant guy, can't think in 3 dimensions. He thinks in 2 dimensions. That's where President Obama is at. He may be a brilliant guy, but he can't think in 3 dimensions. The 5 Taliban leaders should have been used to call for a ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and then use those 5 members as essentially leverage to push the Taliban back into the negotiation process to resolve the current war. He didn't do that. He literally gave up 5 pieces of gold for 1 piece of tin in the form of Bergdahl. So I think it was a bad decision. I think President Obama and his national security team are way outclassed by everybody else out there, and you're seeing the results of really bad thinking, ill-thought thinking, and bad foreign policy.
15 seconds. Do you think the government will let him take a plea?
I think the plea was offered last week. I think that was why you saw the delay. He tried to barter the intelligence he supposedly had given the government in his debriefing. I don't think there's any plea bargain in the cards at this point in time.
I would tend to agree with you as well on that. Please stand by. We're going to turn overseas with Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer after the break. Everything from new airstrikes to a growing realization on the Iranian influence, militarily speaking. MidPoint continues. The U.S.-led coalition in Iraq fighting on the same side as an Iranian-backed militia. Another Iranian-backed militia has obtained sensitive U.S. spy intelligence in Yemen. We got a lot more to talk about as we welcome back Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer once again. Tony, we are now seeing a growing realization of the influence of Iran in the Middle East, so many other places. And here we have the Iranians talking about nuclear negotiations with the Americans, basically saying that here's what we want. And at the same time, they're still doing an awful lot under the scenes, at least seemingly under the scenes, to increase their influence with certain groups, the Houthis, if you will, the Yemenis. Are we missing something here? Are we not paying close enough attention to the fact that Iran is there and it is spreading like a cancer?
The Houthis have been clearly funded by the Iranians, and the Iranians' interest is further destabilization of the region in favor of its influence. I can't believe anybody would miss that. What is missing, obviously, Ed, is American leadership. That's why you see the Saudis working with the Egyptians to go about trying to bring some level of support to President Hadi, the legitimate elected president of Yemen, and you see us kind of sitting on the sidelines. This is notable because what I believe is going on behind the scenes here in Washington is that the Obama White House is so set on making a deal with the Iranians, they're willing to give up literally everything else just to get that deal. That's why we've seen the Iranians with extensive influence in the Tikrit offensive, which we have seen has ground to a stop. The Iranian commander there failed. Now we've had to step in, and I don't think we wanted to do it. Pentagon told me 2 weeks ago they did not want to get involved in Tikrit because they felt it was a quote-unquote Iraqi situation where the Iranians were helping. So all in all, my assessment is that the White House does not want to have to do anything to push back on the Iranians anywhere because they really want to get this nuclear deal done, even if it's a bad deal.
Are we looking at the possibility that with Saudi Arabia now involved in moving defensive weapons onto the border, that with Iran now moving in and helping the Houthis in Yemen, are we looking at the possibility of a full-scale conflagration between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
I don't think we're there yet. I think the biggest concern here, Ed, is making sure that Yemen does not become an ungoverned space. Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula has been the most effective branch of Al-Qaeda. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, Abu Muttalib, the underwear bomber, all were trained and dispatched from Yemen. So this is where I think we need to understand that any ungoverned space will allow Al-Qaeda to grow. ISIS is now there too. So like Libya, like Syria, like Somalia, anytime you have no ungoverned space, terrorists are going to jump in there. So I think that's the biggest fear. But on the larger scale, yes, you have the Sunni and Shia, the Sunni being the Saudis and the Egyptians, the Shia being the Iranians, facing off in proxy wars all over the region. Yemen is the latest meeting engagement, and I think we could see a lot more happen there if we're not careful.
Would you be shocked at all then if you saw Iranian jets perhaps one day take on a Saudi Arabian jet and maybe seek to at least start this conflict, to push it further ahead?
I believe the Iranians are limited in their ability to do expeditionary operations. I think they have the ability to launch airstrikes and launch airplanes, but Yemen is across the Gulf. I don't think they can get there quite so easily. And plus, they are very much tied up supporting the Hezbollah in Syria and supporting their elements in Iraq. I don't think they're prepared militarily to do much more than that. So I think this will grind on for a while. But I wouldn't leave it out if the Iranians are left to their own devices.
You have mentioned, and you kind of indicated a little bit about what I've been talking about the last few days, and that is that with the civil war, and let's call it what it is a civil war in Yemen at this point. It's not as if it's actually going to begin anytime soon. But the fact that now the president has left, there is this monstrous vacuum here. We have a nation that is seeking some sort of leadership. Is it possible, could it be on the board, that you would see the Houthis, Al-Qaeda, you would see the different terrorists perhaps become the government of Yemen one day and then have themselves a nation to run?
The Houthi have been seeking to be the dominant political force for a long time. In 2005, 2006, they attempted this. It resulted in a negotiated settlement. In this case, I don't think they're going to stop. I think they're going to try to take over the entire country. What is key here is that while they are natural enemies of al-Qaeda, that is to say that the Houthi are primarily backed by the Shia elements of Iran, the common enemy is Saudi Arabia. And I think that's why you see Saudi Arabia respond to President Hadi's request for support, because the Saudis do have an interest in doing something to bring stability to the region. Again, Ed, this is an issue that impacts on us directly by the fact that ungoverned space will have terrorist camps and training and operations planned from. So this is important to us. And so I think we have to note that while I don't think the Saudis and Iranians will be fighting each other physically, I think the proxy war will expand and get worse, and I think we have to do something to support the Saudis and the Egyptians in them going in to stabilize Yemen, because I don't think the Houthi can govern. As much as I think they can push Hadi out, I don't think they can govern the country.
Would you see Yemen then as even a greater safe haven than maybe it is now for the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
I think ISIS is going to try to subsume al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula. I think it's almost like a hostile merger, if you will, of the two. They both have similar goals. ISIS has been much more effective in planning and operations, and frankly, many of the al-Qaeda splinters like al-Shabaab, Boko Haram are all signing aboard. So I would predict here in about 6 months you'll probably see al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula sign aboard to join ISIS.
I'm going to mark that down, and quite frankly, the way that you've been getting intelligence, I would have to say that I'm going to put a lot of salt into what you just said here. About 90 seconds.
Thank you, Ed.
Well, we have to here at this point. You have been right so far. Let's get to the last thing here in about 90 seconds we have left.
Sure.
There's now a report, this comes out of the LA Times, that the Iranian-backed rebels have been looting the files in Yemen, and they have garnered a tremendous amount of information on U.S.-backed counterterrorism strikes. They basically now have a tremendous amount of our intelligence. What's the danger?
Oh, great danger. I mean, again, even if we were able to destroy most of the classified documents, unclassified documents and databases left behind, which has been reported, they left computers behind, which can be exploited. This gives the adversaries huge information about our process. Terrorists don't just want classified information. As a matter of fact, I don't think they really want that. They want how we function as an organization, as the United States, so they can target specific parts of how we operate. That's what terrorists do. So what's important here to remember is that this abandonment of those resources was not done to the plan. It was done politically. General Joe Dunford was asked under oath recently about, hey, why do the Marines just kind of up and leave and fly out? And by the way, there was actually something called the Marine Expeditionary Force, MU, available to help the evacuation. Dunford rightfully said, wasn't my call, it was a political call. The Central Command coordinated with the White House. So what we're seeing, Ed, is everything in our current national security policy and execution is a political narrative. The president is not allowing the leaders who are appointed to run the military to run the military.
One of these days, politicians will understand about them being politicized and letting the military run the military because they know many times what is best. Lieutenant Colonel
correct.
Tony Shaffer, always a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend. Keep up the good work and keep knocking them down. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Ed.
All right,
Thank
take
you.
care. When we come back, let's talk about controversy of another kind right here close to America. Remember Pete Rose and gambling? How'd you like another baseball gambling scandal? Could be on deck. Rick Horrow's next.